Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the RAMP podcast for Real Access Motivates Progress. Once again, Tina is preparing for nationals. She leaves this week, so I am your guest host, Diana Perkins, one of her board members, and I will be joined this week by the amazing Raina C. Richardson of WillowSpoon Creative. Welcome, Raina.
Hello, Diana. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you. So Raina and I met each other about a year ago and as part of a resource group for disabled women entrepreneurs. And Raina has been up to some really cool stuff since then. Raina, tell us a little bit about what WillowSpoon Creative is.
Well, WillowSpoon Creative took a while to get to where it is now, but what my focus on is teaching people how to manage and protect their resources, which is time, energy, money, body, mind, and soul. We always think that money is the most important because it's the one that we need really to function so much in life that we get focused on, but we're complex human beings and we actually need to tend to all of them to live fully.
So tell us a little bit about what the rest of those components might look like.
Um, as far as our resources?
Yeah. Resources, of course, there's lots of important ones, but what other kinds of resources are we talking about?
Well, like I said, time, energy, money, body, mind, and soul. So especially as people with disabilities, we're constantly trying to keep our body as happy as it possibly can be. And I don't know about you, but I feel like I never have enough time, especially if I'm perhaps dealing with a flare or something that, makes me have to really adjust my daily life. So learning how to set really good boundaries, learning how to figure out what you need and make sure that you're taking care of that first. And also not forgetting that, your own joy and your own happiness, however small, whether it's from just being out in nature or whether it's reading a good book or watching your friend's cat dance across the desk. We all have to find those moments when and where we can.
Indeed. If you guys are only seeing me, worry not. Our technical director will be back in a moment. Oh, and now I appear to be a rock formation, but hopefully our amazing AV guy, Keyshawn, will be back in a moment. But in the meantime, you can listen to the dulcet tones of our voices. So I know you said that WillowSpoon Creative does a lot of work in the financial literacy space. Tell us
Mm-hmm.
what financial literacy is.
So financial literacy, as I personally define it, is the skills, knowledge, and competency and confidence to make informed and effective decisions on how to use your financial resources, because really financial resources do impact everything in our life. Whether we're trying to be millionaires or not, we need food to access healthcare. I'm sorry, we need money to access healthcare, to access food, to keep a roof over our head. It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and our basic security needs really do, unfortunately, in this day and age, rely on also having access to money. So when we build not only the knowledge and the confidence to take control of those, then we really start to take more control over our own security. And we can build from there.
Everyone can use a higher sense of security these days.
Mhm.
So, what all goes into financial literacy? Like, do I just need to know about my spending and saving habits, or it might be more complicated than that?
I mean, that is certainly a part of it, but it is a bit more complicated than that. I wouldn't necessarily say complicated, but I would maybe say multifaceted, complex, in that um, so much of what our mindset is around money, around finances, has been shaped by our experiences and by the philosophies that we learned from generally our family of origin, but also from our school, workplace. And much of that was shaped by history and the laws that existed, the practices that existed, this entire socio-political background that has shaped this country. And so, it's, I think, easy for us to look back at generations past and go, my gosh, how could they think that? It's like, well, when you actually look at their lived experience, at the access they did and did not have in their lives and what they learned from the generations prior to them, it starts to make a lot more sense. So
Definitely. Well, I know one of the things that you're incredibly knowledgeable about, and I would love to hear some more about, is the history of financial access over time, especially with regards to various underserved populations, and specifically for our audience tonight, with regards to the disability community.
mm-hmm. And I always say we have to remember there's diversity within disability. So while you may have a disability, so many people are at the intersection also of other underserved or previously marginalized communities, whether that is being, identifying as a woman, or whether that is being part of the LGBTQIA plus community, whether that is your BIPOC communities. So when we talk about financial access, we have to also look at how these communities have been impacted, because really, the disability community encompasses all of them. So I'm not sure how much people know about history, but I always believe that in order to understand our present and to make positive changes for the future, we do need to understand that past, because
Definitely.
it's unfortunately, this country has always been very specific about who's allowed to have money, who's allowed to keep money, who's allowed to use money, and who's allowed to grow money.
Totally.
And all of that comes into play. So I'm gonna dial us all the way back to the good old days of 1769. I personally wasn't there, but I hear they were a fantastic time. except that was also the time when women lost autonomy in marriage. We were not even a country yet, but the colonies had adopted the English law that a woman becomes one with her husband. And so since men were the only ones who were considered citizens with legal rights, this really was a huge blow to women. And between 1777 and 1807, all of the states ended up abolishing women's voting rights. So yeah, boo, not a fan, 0 out of 10, do not recommend. But, and I know this one we've talked about, in 1790, there was slight improvement when the Patent Act was passed, and that simplified the patent process. However, since, most states didn't allow women to own property, women inventors were not really going to apply for patents, because then everything would be owned by their husband. But I think we do actually have a patent owner here on our
patent pending, still patent pending, but hopefully soon.
Pending. Well, I would like to highlight that a woman by the name of Mary Keys, who in 1809 was the first woman to file for and hold a patent, but she was also the first Black woman. So she filed a patent for her method of weaving straw and silk for millinery work. So Mary Keys, thank you. Thank you for breaking not one, but two amazing barriers.
Amazing.
Yeah. But it doesn't, and Diana, you have the sort of advanced knowledge of having gone through my my beta testing of so many programs. So you know some of the good stories that are coming up. By good stories, I mean, please have the tissues ready, because we might all start crying. But in 1830, there was the what was called the Indian Removal Act. And so between 1831 and 1850, it was the forced relocation tens of thousands of Native Americans. And we've perhaps heard of this as being the Trail of Tears. Native Americans were removed from their sovereign lands in the Southeast, Mid-Atlantic, and Northern Midwest. And I am currently coming to you from Piscataway land, otherwise known as Arlington, Virginia. But this was financial reason. These were very lush, fertile lands, and quite frankly, the government wanted them. So we see again the rescission of rights. And if you've had the opportunity to learn about the Trail of Tears, it was appropriately named. The intention was not for anyone to survive it. But in 1839, the Married Women's Property Acts were passed. And so at this point, individual states realized, maybe this whole women being, one with their husband's idea, maybe it's not quite working for us. Maybe we need to go ahead and change it up. And so they began, yes, thank you. Individual states began granting married women the right to own their own property. They could keep their income, they could engage in business while married. This was huge. Mississippi, perhaps surprisingly, was the first state to pass this kind of law. And all states had finally done so by 1900. And this was also huge in another way for women, in that for the first time, they weren't automatically liable for their husband's debts. So yes, it's definitely a huge push forward. But as we all know, every time there's a push forward, there's a push back. And we see this in our day-to-day lives. Mid-1800s, there was this little war, perhaps you've heard about it, the Civil War.
Heard of it.
And yeah, it's minor little conflict. We're not still dealing with the fallout of it today at all. But at the end, the 13th Amendment was ratified, which finally abolished slavery. But again, we all know, just because something on paper is abolished, in practice, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're seeing an advancement of rights.
Of course.
And so throughout the rest of the 1800s, there were many laws that really just would advance. We'd get one advancement and then we'd get a pushback. So 1866, there was the Southern Homestead Act. Unfortunately, though, the way they structured that law, it did make Black people ineligible, and the way they priced it was also such that it kept poor whites from applying. So we see, again, this is an opportunity only for very specific people. And you have to look at, well, where did that land come from? We had just taken a whole bunch of land from a group. So, I don't want to just keep going through the history unless you really, really want to hear it.
Why don't we skip ahead then to the disability, when disability rights kind of breaks onto the scene? Obviously, it's all very interconnected, as you said. Most people.
It is very
many identities.
Yeah, it is very interconnected because, we, like I said, just because you may or may not be disabled doesn't mean that you're also not part of another group that is being marginalized, that is being focused on. So first time we really start to see huge steps as far as access is the 504 sit-ins in 1977. And this was in response or regarding the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. That act was finally signed into law by President Nixon after 2 vetoes, and it took basically all of Manhattan traffic being shut down at rush hour by disabled activists on Madison Avenue, led by Judy Heumann, among others. And so that tends to catch people's attention. And even though it had been signed in 1973, in reality, nothing had changed. Just as we learned yesterday from, last week from Professor Skeels, just because you have a law on paper, because you have an act that exists, enforcement doesn't always come to light. And so that was the case here. We really didn't have a whole lot of enforcement, but that sit-in lasted almost 30 days with support from the Black Panther Party to feed participants, including Brad Lomax. And because of that, laws changed. We got the actual enforcement. And that is, I think, in my opinion, the real time that we start to see disability included as part of the discussion. We had the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, but disability was not part of that discussion.
Right. And both in the 504 sit-ins and in the ADA, there was a lot more consideration for certain kinds of disabilities than others. So for the 504 protest, this makes a lot of sense. If you're trying to create the most disruptive environment, so people will sign your damn bill already, it makes sense to put people who are the most visibly disabled in the way to kind of get your point across. And in the original version of the ADA and the ADA amendments as well, more emphasis is placed on physical disabilities or visible disabilities than invisible disabilities. How would you, how do you think that has affected our understanding of disability as a larger narrative?
It definitely is. I know this is something that we've talked about a lot. I always say that invisible disabilities generally aren't as invisible as you might think. But I know it's certainly something that I've experienced where does seem to be like a tiered approach. It's like, well, you're not as disabled. Well, you're not really that disabled. And it is a huge frustration. And I think it's a disservice to the legacy of all those who have fought for disability access to then gatekeep a portion of that community because they don't fit the view of what that should be.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out that, everyone's experience is different, obviously, but for me personally, when I kind of came to the understanding that I had an invisible disability and started to identify that way, I was worried that because of my work in the disability community, that others in the disability community with quote unquote worse disabilities than me would kind of blow me off and say, oh, you're not really disabled. Whereas in reality, and of course this is just my experience, I haven't gotten any of that from the actual disability community. No other person with a disability of any sort has ever made me feel like I'm not disabled enough. The only community that has made me feel that way is non-disabled individuals, which is ironic.
Unfortunately, to an extent, that has been my experience, is that I certainly have been called not disabled enough or not really disabled. And I can't say that's a community belief. I just have to say that is that individual's belief. And for however they're getting to that, whyever they're there, that's on them to work through. But I think there's that saying that you never really know what is going on in someone else's life. So this is a perfect example of that. You never really know what is going on internally, what a person is feeling, what they're struggling with, how well they might be masking it in the specific situation.
Yeah,
And so trying to have empathy, trying to um, extend some good grace, I think goes a long way. You know, my hope is that I always say education equals empowerment, but I do also hope that it equals empathy. I hope that when you understand what history has been and what history how history has shaped people and their experiences and the experiences of um, the generations that came before that that um, passed their mindset down, that we can just start to be a little bit more empathetic of where someone is right now.
definitely. And how do you think that more awareness and inclusion of invisible disabilities, including chronic illness or mental health, will change the way that the disability community and the disability justice movement changes going forward?
Oh, that's a huge question. I don't I don't think we rehearsed that one. Uh, thank you for just calling an audible. Would you kindly repeat that while I take a moment to sip some tea and come up with an answer?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts, and if you're not prepared, that's fine. But if you had any thoughts on how uh, a bigger focus on awareness of and inclusion of invisible disabilities, including chronic illness and mental health, will change the disability community and the disability justice movement going forward.
Um, well, Diana, that's an insightful question. Thank you so much for asking it. I really appreciate the opportunity to answer you. Um, I think uh, I'm actually going to go back to the 504 sit-ins because there is a beautiful quote that is one of my favorites that um, I don't know if this is attributed to Brad Lomax or if it's attributed to Chuck Jackson, who was also one of the Black Panther members. So um, I, I don't want to get that wrong, but the quote was, we support you because you're asking America to change, to treat you like human beings, like you belong. We always support people fighting for their rights. And so I think that right there, when you understand no one is a member of a single community. We don't live in silos. And uh, the more we're aware of that and the more we collectively come together to stand up for our rights, to advocate for one another, I think that is that's when we all start to win. Like the work that RAMP does is let's make it accessible. If we make it accessible for people with disabilities, then we're really making it accessible for everyone. And I think that same inclusion of someone with invisible disabilities is the same way when we're making sure that they are part of the conversation, when we're making sure that we recognize what those needs are that exist, then we're not leaving anyone out of the discussion.
That was a great answer to a curveball. Thank you for that
Thank you. You're
insightful
welcome. I'm going to
response.
sip some more tea now.
Please do. Um, I would also love to talk about your experience. We're both small business owners with disabilities, and so I would love to hear about your experience with that so far. I know you've been in the small business game a lot longer than I have, so give us some advice for any future entrepreneurs out there.
Well, yes, I have been. I was a freelancer in technical theater for almost 25 years, and prior to starting WillowSpoon Creative, I did have a small food business, and really, yes, I unfortunately, from my experience, I know we say so many times that entrepreneurship is a great opportunity for people with disabilities because you do, at least in theory, have much more flexibility. But one of the largest frustrations that I have had in the past, 7 or so years is really seeing how much entrepreneurs with disabilities are not even considered. They're not even in the conversation to put their needs forth, and that has been hugely frustrating. I've been just a little bit vocal about it. um, but I think one of the big frustrations for me is um, seeing time and time again, programs that exist, rightfully so, for other groups to help move them forward, whether that is women, whether that is BIPOC, whether that is LGBTQIA. And we certainly see great programs for veterans with disabilities. But when I've gone to directors of workplace associations or entrepreneurship support, whether that's through local government, state governments, whatever, and say, well, what programs do you have for entrepreneurs with disabilities? They'll start talking about programs for veterans with disability. I'm like, well, what if you're not a veteran, but you still have a disability? And the answer I've gotten is, oh, well, why would they need anything? Which
There's a lot of
really,
ignorance surrounding the disability
yes.
community.
And I'm like, oh, okay, this is going to be a longer conversation. This is okay. All right. Better get another
Yeah.
cup of coffee. So I think it comes not from an inability to create those spaces. It comes because if you do at least have one group with disabilities that you recognize needs assistance, um, then you have the capability to expand that to anyone with a disability. It's just the mindset that either there isn't an interest, there isn't a need. I don't know. It's, I think, going to be individual for each person. But um, the first step you have to take is advocating for yourself, and in hope that that turns a light bulb on somewhere to go, oh, well, we're not actually thinking about this. Well, we're not actually looking to, this community who might be underserved, who might have needs, who we might be able to help and we might be able to promote. So, first step, you have to advocate for yourself and let these groups see not only why that support is needed, but why they are uh, perfectly placed to provide it. So
Well,
it's
luckily, you and I are both pretty vocal advocates for ourselves, but I know it can definitely be a struggle. And you and I have spoken at length about lack of access to support and resources for disabled small business owners. What do you think is the
mhm.
most important resource or support that we should be prioritizing getting access to for these groups?
I think it's I think that's going to be such a varied answer depending on what that entrepreneur needs, what their specific disability is, what their business is. I'll just give you one example that um, has been a huge frustration for me. Uh, the benefit that of the pandemic, which was by no means a great thing, but if there is a silver lining, it's the fact that we did increase virtual access for so many people.
Yeah.
And for many members of the disability community, suddenly we have access to things that we have not been able to have access to before. And that includes training programs, that includes work from home, that includes um, it could telehealth even. And so for people who perhaps um, deal with fatigue a lot or deal with pain, and that traveling to and from a place really depletes a lot of your spoons. Now suddenly we have the ability to participate in these. Now suddenly there is access to things that financially benefit us. Um, and it was amazing. And I certainly understand Zoom fatigue for some people. There are people who need that face-to-face interpersonal connection. And I in no way dismiss that. But Now we do see so many of those virtual opportunities starting to disappear, which means that access is being rescinded.
Yeah.
Um, and I know for me that has been a huge frustration. I won't name the name, but there is an organization, a um, state government organization that provides really great training on a variety of entrepreneurial issues um, weekly. And I've asked them, hey, can you turn on the closed captioning? And they've just said, no, no, we don't do that. And I'm like, but you're a state organization and you are funded by the SBA. So under the ADA, you kind of have to.
Yeah.
And it has been round and round and round about, no, we just don't do that. We don't, no one has a need for that. It's like, well, once
I'm
again,
asking for it. Somebody has a need for
yes,
it.
yes. I feel a little bit like a certain senator, once again, I am here asking you for access to the closed captioning. Perhaps that will be a meme this week. But I think that's certainly one way to provide access to a large number of people, certainly not everyone, but a large number of people. And so when organizations start dialing back on that, you're then rescinding those opportunities.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, even those who have no disability whatsoever, have gotten used to and hugely benefited from that access, that ability to work from home. People with young children, people who are caretakers for aging relatives, and just people who are, prefer to stay home. People have saved a lot of money, which will help them with their financial
Mm-hmm,
independence by
mm-hmm,
not having to commute to the office every day.
mm-hmm. And it's
So,
also, I think, opened up tremendous networking opportunities. You're in Ramp is based in Rhode Island. I'm here in Virginia. We would never have met if it weren't for the virtual opportunities. I've been able to connect with people in Europe. I've been able to connect with people on the West Coast. And if I had to say, go to an in-person location in order to network with someone, in order to meet them, in order to make this connection and have these conversations, in all likelihood, that wouldn't happen. And it would be a tremendous cost.
yeah, and for all sorts of situations, both because of my disability, I wouldn't go to as many in-person things as I do virtually, but also because I just moved to Boston during the pandemic, and people here drive just in a ridiculous fashion. And so I don't drive in Boston very much, and I don't go to in-person events in Boston, even though things are opening up now because your girl learned to drive in Kentucky. And uh, so I can avoid a tractor with the best of them, but I-95 is not my friend.
No, I don't think I-95 is anyone's friend, if we're being honest about it. I personally, because of one of my conditions, cannot fly. So I have to, if I'm going to travel anywhere, it has to be on land. So if that's bus, if that's car, if that's train. And those trips are exhausting. They really do just deplete all of the spoons. So if I had to factor in a trip to somewhere, staying, I'd have to get there at least a day or two early to get a hotel so that I could recover, so that I could be at a point where I could actively participate in that event and then do it all in reverse. That's a huge financial expense. That
Yeah,
is, quite frankly, not where I want to be spending my money. I
and
don't want to
time
be
and energy.
spending, right, and time and energy. And and the impact that it's going to have on my body just to participate in one event. That's not saying that we should do away with all in-person events. All I'm saying is that as you're creating in-person events, look at what virtual access would look like.
Definitely.
Adobe Max does that every year. Adobe, the software company, they have an in-person conference, but it is also streamed virtually so that people can participate from all over the world. And it's not impossible to do. It might take some creativity. It certainly takes having people who need the virtual access to be part of the conversation. Invite those people in, say, what do you need? How can we support you? How can we make this beneficial to a larger community? But that doesn't always happen.
Yeah. So you've mentioned spoon theory now twice. Will you give a little, just a brief explanation for our listeners who might not be spoonies, what spoons are?
Yeah, so spoons are, it's based on the spoon theory, and I hope I get her name correct. I believe it's pronounced Christine Misrandino. I may get that wrong. But she wrote this article many years ago about explaining to a friend um, what having lupus was like. She has lupus. And so they were in a diner. She went around to all the tables, collected all of the spoons, and gave the bundle to her friend and said, okay, you've just woken up. Each activity you do throughout the day has a price in spoons. So as they, talked about getting up and you need to take your medication, but before that you have to eat because you can't take your medication on an empty stomach. She would withdraw a certain amount of spoons from the friend's handful. And uh, by, what it would have been dinner time, the friend only had one spoon left. And she's like, oh, but making dinner and doing the dishes is going to cost you 3 spoons and you only have 1 spoon left. How are you going to do this? And it was a a demonstration in how you just simply don't have the energy to do everything. You have to know how much it's going to cost you. And the friend, started to cry. And that's when Christine pulled out a spoon. She's like, this is why you always keep a spare spoon for yourself. You keep that spare spoon. And if
I love
you
a
notice,
visual aid.
yes, and it was a reminder to always keep that spoon for yourself, which if you wonder how WillowSpoon got its name, that is the spoon in WillowSpoon. It is a reminder to keep that spoon for myself. And businesses come and go. But if I don't keep that spoon for myself, there's only one of me. And I think that's probably all the world can handle. But there is only one of me. So I have to remember to keep that spoon for myself.
Definitely. I think it's a really great visual aid and just framework for explaining to non-disabled friends or family how your energy might be different than theirs. I know it's been really
Mm-hmm.
helpful for me in relationships, as well as honestly, it's a good way to think about tying back into financial literacy. Disabled people are better at budgeting in some
You
because
have
they've
to
had so
budget
much
your time and
experience.
energy.
Exactly. Um,
Absolutely.
I know we've talked about a lack of access, but I also want to take the time to ask if there's any resources that you have benefited from that you'd like to shout out for anybody else who's looking to maybe start a business of their own.
I think you honestly have to know yourself really well. Uh, know where your skill sets are, know where your challenges are. Um, One of the reasons that I started WillowSpoon Creative, and we'll see this more in the programs that I hope to build out in the next, um, 3 to 9 months, is I did unfortunately see so many people who did not have financial literacy skills starting their business. Very helpful as they should be. They should have that passion. They should have that joy, but they didn't have the financial knowledge to understand what that business needed to look like on paper to be successful. And um, it was heartbreaking to see. I saw so many people who saw this business that they were starting as an opportunity to break generational chains, to be the first in their family to start a business, to be the first in their family to be successful, to break out of a mindset and a life that society had set them up to fail.
Yeah.
And so, but you need more than that passion. If it was just passion, so many people would succeed. And I, I it broke my heart. And I had certainly learned plenty of lessons the hard way myself. Um, but I don't want to see that happen again. I know you can't save everyone, but that's where I think getting the financial education and um, being passionate about your business, but knowing you're more than your business um, is really important. As far as um, any specific tools, I'd say, like most people with disabilities, I've had to adapt what I find to suit my own needs.
Of
It's
course.
not necessarily set up to um, include me, but I, take what works, leave the rest, and just be thankful for having found that.
Definitely. Well, one of my favorite resources and my lovely co-host is going to be WillowSpoon. WillowSpoon has been operating kind of in stealth mode so far, but I've been lucky enough to be a beta tester on some of the upcoming material. Can you tell us more about what is next for WillowSpoon? What does the future of WillowSpoon Creative look like?
Oh man, the future. Well, I'm gonna just put it out big because why not?
Oh
What I am manifesting this future to be, what I'm calling it out right now to be, is again talking about that financial literacy, financial access. I do believe that we have to understand the external, so those socio-political um, aspects that have been passed down and shaped our mindsets, but understanding that internal mindset that we probably inherited from our family of origin, that we probably inherited from what we learned in school, from what we learned in the workforce, um, and understanding how those two come together in our daily financial habits. I will be doing more in-depth financial history education, like you've witnessed, and
would recommend.
uh,
10 out of 10. Sign up. You made me
um,
care about economics and history, two classes I refused to take in college because I hated them in high school. So I'm a convert. Sign up.
um, and my goal is to educate as many people as possible and to empower them. And I do absolutely see a future point where I am able to start partnering with organizations that serve um, marginalized communities to bring this education to them, because financial literacy, financial access is lack of that make us vulnerable on so many levels, and I am tired of seeing people being vulnerable. I
Amen.
you know that has to change, and you know um, I think that if we want to change our lives and that of the future generations, we have to do that hard work, that ugly work, that looking at what history has been, that looking at how it shapes our daily lives, um, and understanding where people have been shut out, where they are still shut out, perhaps not in an overt manner, but on some level, they are still shut out, and standing up to say, yeah, you can't do that anymore. You just can't. But here is an easy way to fix it. Um,
Yeah, what I really loved about your first workshop that I took about financial literacy was understanding how the history of financial access shaped the society that we live in today. And so, a lot of times you hear things like, "Oh, why does this group need special privileges or special resources or whatever, even though it's, it's just leveling the playing field. It's trying to make up for all that history and all that time that we haven't had the same access to the resources that we should have.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, there are so many court cases, Supreme Court cases that have limited our access, and I say our, meaning women's access to the ability to work, the ability to vote, um,
Ability to control our
I'm
own bodies.
to control our bodies. Yep. I hear so many people saying, "Oh my gosh, SCOTUS has gone rogue," and I'm like, "Oh no, 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 no. This isn't the first time they've come down like this to restricting access." And I know that, to put it in perspective, we may feel that these civil, financial, and employment rights have been around for a long time, but the reality is that they are actually very new to the lifetime of this country. And these rights are not guaranteed. They can always be taken away, especially if we become complacent or cynical or stop paying attention. If we're trying to pursue perfection, um, we might lose it all in the process.
Yeah, this another thing that I really took away from your class was how recent all of this is. Like I am getting married next month to an amazing man who happens to be Japanese, and interracial marriage wasn't legalized on a national level until 1967. Like my parents were both alive and my marriage wouldn't have been legal, and that is absolutely wild to me.
Yep.
You hear about that and you think it's like, oh, the 1700s, the 1800s, something like that. No, like this was within our lifetimes. I mean, not my lifetime, but my parents' lifetime, my
Right.
grandparents' lifetime, and that's absolutely wild.
The ADA is within both of our lifetimes.
Yeah.
It is, the history of the country is this, but the history of rights and access is like this. It's so super tiny.
Yeah.
Really, the ADA, that was only 1990. It is the new kid on the civil rights block. And while it may not have quite the right stuff, it is still hanging tough. Gen X, that was a shout out to you. I hope you got that. Uh, but this was the first time that people with disabilities could basically said, no, you can't be discriminated against in the workplace. Prior to that, it was legal. 1978 was the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, where prior to that, you could be fired for being pregnant or having a condition related to pregnancy. Not
Wow.
even that it interfered with your job, just being pregnant. A
How
lot of
dare
that
you?
was fixed. How dare you?
How dare you?
Well, I wouldn't say a lot of that was fixed, but a tremendous step forward was the 1993 Family Medical Leave Act.
Yeah.
Now, not all businesses and not all employees qualify for FMLA, um, but it does allow the eligible employees of covered organizations, to take up to 12 weeks of unpaid work, or unpaid leave rather, um, and have their job protected. That last part, and have their job protected,
So important.
is vital, is so important. Um, and these are so new. They are, you know, really in their infancy when you think
Yeah.
about how long we've existed without these rights. Um, I think
Yet
it's
still America is the only major nation that doesn't have any paid medical leave for pregnancy and childbirth, but that's a whole separate issue.
yeah, that gets me saltier than a Cheesecake Factory entree, but
So, Raina, it's been really lovely to have you this evening. Is
thank
there
you.
anything else that you want to let our listeners know, and where can we find more of you?
Right now, the best place to stay up to date is on our Instagram page, which is WillowSpoon at WillowSpoon Creative. And yes, more and more exciting opportunities will be uh, rolling out over the next few weeks as I get things together. Um, Thank you for having me. Thanks to Ramp for creating this space to, especially during Disability Pride Month, to elevate the stories and the voices of people with disabilities. And yeah, let's not be quiet.
Thanks again for coming. And thank all of you for joining us. I want to let you know before I sign off about a special deal we've got on the Lap Snap this week. So for the celebration of the 32nd anniversary of the ADA this week until Tuesday the 26th, you can get $32 off the Lap Snap on our website with the code ADA32. So go to thelapsnap.com and use code ADA32. Tina won't be back until August, so I've got one more week with you guys, and I'll be back next week with special guest Carlos Martinez, the executive director of Bridges. Bridges has an amazing boutique retail space called the Independence Cafe, and we'll be hearing all about it next week. So don't forget to tune in, same time. And as always, don't just sit there, make a difference.
To take home the Golden Gloves, you've got to put in the work, and you've got to be tough as nails. Ashley Kalis was driven to achieve. Today, Kalis is still fueled by that same hope, grit, and determination. A mother of 3 school-aged boys and successful business owner who ran testing and vaccination sites across the state. Kalis is the fighter Rhode Island needs right now because it's time for a change. Ashley Kalis for governor.